Hey guys, for reading today, what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to reread our story from Hey World, Here I Am about Mrs. Buell. I'm going to reread it without stopping, and your assignment today is going to be to write a summary. You can use some of these sentences you wrote last week to kind of help you do that. Or you can just kind of listen and pause as we go and be writing down the important things. Remember, a summary is a brief description of what's going on. We're not including kind of minor details. For example, in the first part of our story, let me get in here. In the first part of our story, they talk about she can sell you a scoop for 15 cents. That's not really a key important detail. A key important idea. It's an interesting detail, but it's not necessarily the most important thing on that page or in that section. So remember, we are looking for those really important things, the main parts of the story, and those really important ideas. If you think that maybe it's just an interesting detail, then it's not something that you should include in your summary. So I've taken pictures of the book so that you guys can follow along. I do have writing in here, just a couple notes and things, so just ignore that. I'm just going to skip over those. But I'm going to go ahead and read, and then you'll write your summary. So this is Mrs. Buell. For years and years, for what seemed like forever, I've gone to Buell's when I had a dime to spare. It's a run-down, not very clean corner store. Kids go there mostly for licorice and bubblegum and jawbreakers and popsicles and comic books and cones. She only has 3 flavors and the cones taste stale. Still, she'll sell you 1 scoop for 15 cents. It's not a full scoop, but it's cheaper than anywhere else. It's the only place I know where a kid can spend 1 penny. Mrs. Buell is run down too, and a grouch. She never smiles or asks you how you are. Little kids are scared to go in there alone. We laugh at them, but really, we understand. We felt it too when we were smaller and had to face her towering behind the counter. She was always the same, except that once. I tripped going in and fell and scraped my knee. It hurt so much that I couldn't move for a second. I was winded too, and I had to gasp for breath. I managed not to cry out, but I couldn't keep back the tears. Mrs. Buell is big, but she moved like lightning. She hauled a battered wooden chair out from behind the curtain and hung across the back. Then, without a word, she picked me up and sat me down on it. We were alone in the store, but I wasn't afraid. Her hands, scooping me up, had been work-roughened. Hard, but kind. She still didn't speak. Instead, she took a bit of rag out of her sweater pocket, bent down, and wiped the smear of blood off my knee. The rag looked grayish, but her hands were gentle. I think she liked doing it. Then she fetched a Band-Aid and stuck it on. Does it still sting? She asked, speaking at last in a voice I've never heard her use before. I shook my head, and she smiled. At least, I think she did. It only lasted a fraction of a second, and I wasn't looking straight at her. At that moment, Johnny Trisano came in with 1 nickel clutched in his fist. He was so intent on the candies he hardly noticed me. He stood and stood, trying to decide. Make up your mind or take yourself off, she growled. She had gone back behind the counter. I waited for her to look at me again so that I could thank her. But when he left, she turned her back and began moving things around on the shelves. I had meant to buy some jujubes, but I lost my nerve. After all, everybody knew she hated kids. She was probably sorry now that she'd fixed my knee. I slunk out without once opening my mouth. Yet, whenever I looked down and saw the Band-Aid, I felt guilty. As soon as 1 corner came loose, I pulled it off and threw it away. I didn't go near the store for weeks. She was terribly fat. She got so hot in summer that her hair hung down in wet strings and her clothes looked limp. In winter, she wore the same sweater every day, a man's gray one, too big, with the sleeves pushed up. They kept slipping down, and she'd shove them back 1,000,000 times a day. Yet she never rolled up the cuffs to make them shorter. She never took days off. She was always there. We didn't like her or hate her. We sort of knew that selling stuff to kids for a trickle of small change wasn't a job anybody would choose, especially in that poky little place with flies in summer and the door being opened all winter, letting in blasts of cold air. Even after that day when she fixed my knee, I didn't once wonder about her life. Then I stopped at Buell's one afternoon, and she wasn't there. Instead, a man and woman I'd never laid eyes on were behind the counter sorting through stacks of stuff. They were getting some boxes down off a high shelf right then, so they didn't hear me come in. I was so amazed I just stood there, gawking. How Ma stood this cruddy hole I'll never know, the woman said, backing away from a cloud of dust. Didn't she ever clean? Give the subject a rest, Glow, he answered. She's dead. She won't bother you any longer. I tried, Harry. You know I tried. Over and over. I told her she could move in with us. God knows I could have used a bit of cash and her help looking after those kids. I think I must have made a sound then. Anyway, she whirled around and saw me. This place is closed, she snapped. Harry, I thought I told you to lock the door. What did you want? I didn't want anything from her, but I still could not believe Mrs. Buell wasn't there. I stared around. I said we're shut. If you don't want anything, beat it, she told me. The minute I got home, I phoned Emily. She said her mother had just read it in the paper. She had a daughter, Emily said, her voice echoing my own sense of shock. She died of a heart attack. Kate, her whole name was Catherine Ann Buell. Catherine, I said slowly. My name is really Catherine, although only Dad calls me by it. I can't believe it somehow. No, Emily said, she was always just Mrs. Buell. I told her about Glow and Harry. After we hung up, though, I tried to imagine Mrs. Buell as a child. Instead, I saw her bending down, putting that Band-Aid on my knee. Her hair had been thinning on top, I remembered, and she'd had dandruff. She had tried not to hurt me. Glow's voice talking about her had been so cold. Had she had anyone who loved her? It seemed unlikely. Why hadn't I smiled back? But to be honest, something else bothered me even more. Her going had left a hole in my life. Because of it, I knew for the first time that nothing was safe. Not even the everyday, taken-for-granted background of my being. Like Mrs. Buell pushing up her sweater sleeves and giving me my change. Okay, so that is our story from Hey World, Here I Am. What you're going to do now is you are going to go ahead and write a summary of just that section, of just that chapter. If you need to, go back and either pause the video so you can read the page on your own, or listen to me read it again to kind of help get an idea of the most important ideas and information. Remember, those little interesting details don't necessarily need to be included. That's not the point of a summary. The point of a summary is to give the main ideas in a nice, quick way. Your sentence requirements are in the assignment, so make sure you check those out. And don't forget, too, that you can either type to answer on Seesaw, or you can write it in your journal, handwrite it with like pencil or something if that's easier, and then take a